Today we have a great lineup of speakers that have joined us to talk about the impacts of mobile source pollution and community strategies to deploy zero-emission vehicles to reduce pollution and enhance health outcomes in these communities. So I'm excited to be discussing this topic today. NASEO recently did a member survey to see what everybody's priorities were, and the #1 priority for NASEO members was electric vehicle infrastructure and transportation electrification, and the #2 was equity and supporting disadvantaged communities. So I think that this presentation today really does a great job of combining those two issues and looking at ways that state energy offices can support reducing pollution as well as transportation electrification and engaging communities along the way. So we have a really great setup of speakers today. We have Will Barrett from the American Lung Association and Seth Hartley from ICF. We're going to be discussing a recent report they did to help quantify the impacts of transportation electrification. And then we have Paul Allen from NJ Bradley, who's their senior vice president, and is going to be talking about a community engagement project he recently worked on in Newark, New Jersey. So I will pass things over to them, give as much time for presentations and Q&A as possible. And then, so if you do have questions, feel free to, you can put it in the chat, or you can unmute your line and just ask the presenters themselves. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and I will pass things over to Will and Seth in order to kick off our presentations.
Hi, thanks, Dylan, and thanks everybody for allowing us to jump in here and share some of our work.
Will, if it's possible to put your mic closer to your mouth, that would be great. Just can't really make out what you're saying.
Sorry about that. So I'm Will Barrett. I'm the director of Clean Air Advocacy Association. I'm based in California, and I will basically I focus on air pollution and climate issues, largely in the transportation sector. But also some in the clean energy space and largely in California, but also support our team's work across the country. I'll get Seth to say a few words of introduction, and then I'll get our slides up so everyone can see those. So thank you again for the opportunity. Seth, are you connected?
Can you hear me now?
There you go. Yep.
Yep.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I was muted. Okay, sure. I'm Seth Hartley. I'm an atmospheric scientist with ICF. Have about 18 years of consulting experience, and I really focus on the intersection of transportation, air quality, climate change, and public health. I've led many studies on pollutant emissions, dispersion, mitigation, exposure, community health risk, and I really focus on everything that comes out of a tailpipe, sort of what we call criteria pollutants, toxic air pollutants, and greenhouse gas emissions. I've been with ICF since 2002, and I do a lot of work at the federal, state, and local levels, corporate clients, and others. And I have a master's in atmospheric science. Let's see. Okay, that looks good. Let's see. Oh. All right. And I'm sorry, I'm not going to be on camera because I'm on an island right now dealing with very slow internet connection. So you just have to listen to me, I think. Sorry about that. Okay, so let's see. So we can go ahead and get started. So today we're going to talk about first about the new Lung Association report on the state of the air, and then we'll talk about the 2020 report that the Lung Association and ICF did together to it's called the Road to Clean Air, and it's really a focus on the benefits of a transition to ZEV, zero-emission vehicles generally, but especially electric vehicles. We'll talk about the scope of the analysis and the scenario we considered, and then we'll summarize our findings on potential national health and climate benefits that could arise from this kind of transition. And then we'll talk about the policy implications of such a transition, and then quickly we'll walk through some of the media and public feedback we got on the report.
Great.
I think you can go to the next slide. There you go.
So just this past April, the American Lung Association released our 22nd annual State of the Air report. And this is a report that we put out each year to really raise, highlight the impacts of the progress we've made across the country in terms of air pollution, as well as the challenges that we still face in terms of ozone and particle pollution across the United States. Basically, what we look at is a 3-year window of air quality monitoring data that's been quality assured by the US EPA. And in this case, we looked at 2017, 2018, and 2019 as the data set for the report. And what we found was that over 40% of all Americans still live in communities or counties that are impacted by unhealthy levels of either ozone or particle pollution. And that comes out to about 135 million Americans that are impacted. What we know, too, is that within this year's report, we're able to highlight the fact that we're still seeing major disparities in terms of who is most impacted by the unhealthy air days that we see across the United States. So for this year's report, we saw people of color winding up are 3 times more likely to live in a county that receives failing grades for ozone, unhealthy ozone pollution days, unhealthy particle pollution days, and unhealthy levels of annual particle pollution. So those are the 3 categories that we report on each year. And clearly you see that a person of color is much more likely to live in places in the United States with the worst air quality than a white person would be. For a person of color is 61% more likely to live in a county with just 1 failing grade. And here, again, 3 times more likely to live in a county that has Fs across the board in our report. So really trying to draw attention through this report to the disparities that we know exist in terms of inequitable exposures to unhealthy air, as well as the disparities in health impacts that follow. Another theme that I wanted to highlight for this group was that climate change is making the job of cleaning the air much more difficult. We've seen in the last several reports where we've been tracking this, looking at, where do the 3 years that we're looking at rank among the hottest ever. And this year, it's 3 of the 6 most, hottest years on record globally. We also see the impacts of major wildfires show up in the report every year lately. And this year was no different. We actually saw Fairbanks, Alaska ranked as the most polluted by unhealthy particle pollution days in the 2021 report. And that was directly related to some of the major wildfires that that region experienced in 2019. So I think it's important to note just, again, that the progress we've seen and the progress that's been made over the 50 years of the Clean Air Act is becoming more threatened because of the impacts of climate change. Extreme heat adding to our ozone pollution challenges, as well as the wildfires and droughts that are really ramping up particle pollution challenges. So essentially, we have to work harder to get to the same benefit due to climate change. Here, just a slide highlighting, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, basically the wide range of public health challenges that stem from air pollution. Again, ozone and particle pollution are 2 of the most widespread pollutants across the United States and add to a wide range of negative health consequences. These range from irritation to wheezing and coughing, asthma attacks, breathing particle pollution can cause lung cancer. And also we know that there are, premature deaths are a severe case, but there's, again, a wide range of negative health consequences of unhealthy air, and that's what we're really trying to bring attention to with the State of the Air report each year, and really highlight some of the strategies and solutions that we know we need to employ to get to clean air for all communities and to eliminate those disparities in negative health outcomes. One of the ways that we did that in the most recent years is, as Seth mentioned, last year we put out the Road to Clean Air report, which was issued in September of 2020. And really, this report recognizes that the leading source of our air pollution and climate pollution in the United States is the transportation sector. The transportation sector has moved beyond or ahead of, unfortunately, the energy sector as the leading source of carbon pollution in the United States, and it's also the leading source of smog or ozone forming and particle pollution forming, NOx emissions or oxides of nitrogen. So again, we wanted to highlight the benefits of a transition to zero-emission vehicles across the United States. We worked with ICF to develop the scenarios and work through the modeling. And I'm going to turn it over to Seth to walk through some of the details of how we got this report together and share some of the results with you. So with that, I'll turn it back to Seth, and we'll jump right into the Road to Clean Air.
Okay, thanks, Will. So on this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the scenario that we modeled for an electric vehicle phase-in schedule. I've shown two basic things here. The first is the phase-in schedule for sales of electric vehicles that we modeled under our scenario. So first of all, we looked at 10 different vehicle categories, and they're actually shown, well, in both the left and the right sides, but it ranges from passenger vehicles to transit and school buses. We looked at refuse trucks, long haul, both combination and single long haul trucks, single unit long haul trucks. We looked at things like airport shuttles and drayage port trucks, delivery vans, and then other kind of miscellaneous short haul single unit trucks. And we had a phase-in schedule for sales that's based on what we consider to be feasible and based on ARB and other kind of metrics for phase-in to electric vehicle fleets in those categories. So the figure on the right shows the phase-in for vehicle sales over time in our scenario for those 10 categories. And then on the left in the boxes, we've shown the sort of ultimate time period to hit 100% EV sales for these categories. I think there are a couple of important things to note here that, we did this in 2020, and in some cases, we may already be kind of behind the curve of what's happening in some states, especially. The other thing is that these are vehicle sales, so we used a custom fleet model to propagate these sales fractions through use on the road. So even though you might have 100% EV sales of passenger cars in 2040, you're actually going to have polluting vehicles on the road, conventional internal combustion engine vehicles on the road for a long time after that. Okay, I think you can go to the next slide. Okay, so this slide is, there's a lot to read here, but honestly, this is about 4 months of work in one slide, so I don't want to dwell on it too much, other than just kind of give you a flavor of all the work that we did here and all the different parts of the modeling chain that we included to get these results. So we started with the vehicle categories and the phase-in schedule that I just showed you. And then we ran MOVES at a national scale. This is EPA's MOVES emissions model to get total emissions, energy use, and sort of business as usual fleet populations on the road for all of the modeled years. And from that, we determined things like energy factors, emissions factors, and other things that varied by each of the vehicle categories that we just talked about, as well as the fuel types and the vehicle ages. And then we used a custom fleet model to translate these sales projections that I just showed you into vehicle fractions on the road and actually sort of activity patterns used by vehicle categories. And that also would vary by age, fuel type, and vehicle category. And then we did the emissions modeling. And so there's several components that go into that emissions modeling. There is what we're calling the downstream. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with these terms, but when we say downstream, we really mean tailpipe and then also brake and tire wear from the vehicles on the road. And then we have upstream emissions. And in our case, what we mean by upstream is the increase in emissions from electricity generation that would go along with an increasing fraction of electric vehicles on the road, and a decrease in fuel refining and transport emissions that would go along with a decrease in conventional fuels consumed. It's important to note that for the downstream component, we modeled emissions because we're looking nationally at the on-road fleet. For the upstream emissions, we modeled changes. So rather than absolute values, reduction from a national total value, we looked at the changes in those emissions due to the scenario. And the other thing to note here, and we'll talk about this again in a minute, but for the electricity generation, we had two different cases, we called them. One of them was an AEO case. That's electricity generation grid emissions factors that are based on EIA mixed projections. We'll talk about this in a minute, but it includes sort of a generous estimate of coal out to the future, from about 24% in 2018 to about 14% out in 2050. The other case that we looked at is what we call the ALA case, and that is a higher reliance on renewables and a decreasing amount of coal power. This is based on the BNEO, Bloomberg report for 2050. Let's see, and then the final step, so we have one electrification scenario with two different cases for the electricity providing the energy for that. We modeled that through the emissions component, and then also used the EPA's COBRA, that's the Co-Benefits Risk Assessment tool, to model and quantify monetize changes in adverse health outcomes due to the changes in the emissions for these three sectors: the on-road fleet, the fuel refining and transport, and the electricity generating sector throughout all the modeled years. Okay. One thing to note is that, I'm sorry, if you can go back for 1 second. I talked about this just briefly earlier, but in COBRA, all health benefits are related to PM concentrations. So we have PM concentrations that are related to human health outcomes, and then we also have CO2e actually, impacts that are related to climate change outcomes, and we related those through the social cost of carbon. We also have brake wear and tire wear emissions. So when you go to an electric vehicle fleet, you're reducing the tailpipe emissions, but not necessarily, or to a lesser degree, the brake wear and tire wear. So that you'll see that in the PM results in a minute. Okay, thanks, Will. Sorry about that. Carry on. Okay, so this slide is just a summary of the national grid mix we used in both cases for the electrification scenario. Like I said in the last slide, we have both greenhouse gas and criteria pollutant emissions impacts. The health impacts from those two cases are related through PM emissions and both the source of the pollutant and where the receptors are relative to those sources. So, people living next to roads versus people living within some distance of a refinery or a power plant. This shows the electrification scenarios that we modeled. So we had the AEO scenario for all three modeled years. That's 2018, 2030, and 2050. And in the ALA scenario, we moved to a, reduced dependence on coal. ALA only is different in the 2050 year. So this shows the grid mix that we use nationally with the GREET model. I think I failed to mention that on the previous slide, with the GREET model to get emissions factors for each of these two cases. I think just one thing to note here is that we didn't model our own scenario for upstream emissions, and we didn't dive into policy decisions on carbon targets or things like that. We took these two sort of predefined cases as what the national grid could look like in these years. Okay, go to the next slide, I think. So this is the first of 3 slides that I'll show with the emissions results. So you'll see a comparison here of on-road vehicles presented from the modeling run that accounts for the fleet shift from conventional fuels, gas and diesel, and the refining, as well as the power sector. So what you can see here are steep reductions in the on-road fleet compared to the business as usual modeling, and even greater when you factor in the upstream shifts. So the top chart here is downstream only, and the bottom chart is downstream plus changes in the upstream emissions. So these are net changes and then shown as a % reduction relative to the on-road fleet. So you can get changes here, you'll see up to greater or equal to 100% because you have a change in upstream refining emissions, for example, that when coupled with the downstream tailpipe emissions can get you greater than 100% reduction relative to the BAU tailpipe. So I have shown here the ALA scenario with the 2050 results highlighted on your with the big numbers in the arrows. And so this is for NOx reductions. Important to note that these are individual year results for the 3 years that we modeled, not cumulative results. Okay, you can go on to the next slide. This is the same thing, but for PM. And as I said, you can see greater than 100% reduction of, relative to the tailpipe PM. It's also not quite as reduced from the downstream only because of the brake wear and tire wear impacts that are preserved in the transition to EVs. And then the next slide. And this one shows similar things, but with carbon dioxide, CO2e reductions. I think this one's interesting because you really do start to see the impact of increasing VMT in the BAU case, where you're really starting to see an increase over time. Yeah, exactly. Okay, I think that's enough for that. Will, do you want to take over here? You're muted, Will. There we go.
So thank you. I'll just end here with the, or make the transition here. All of that is, was the baseline to get to some results that we were able to report out in terms of the climate benefits of the transition to zero emission transportation, as well as the public health benefits. So here you see this slide. In the year 2050 alone, the modeled year, we saw 113 billion in climate benefits through the reductions in carbon pollution in that single year 2050. And this is presented as the social cost of carbon based on the Obama era global impact valuation. And essentially what we did here was looked at it and found significant tonnages of pollutants and translated that into the social cost of carbon to get the 113 billion in that single year in global climate benefit. For public health benefits, similarly, we saw large results in the year 2050 based on those pollution reductions. This is a national figure where we saw over 6,000 premature deaths avoided in the year annually in 2050, over 90,000 asthma attacks avoided, and over 415,000 lost workdays avoided because the air is cleaner and the negative health consequences of that unhealthy air are eliminated, and therefore translates through the COBRA modeling to reductions in negative health endpoints that you see here. One of the things that we were able to do is to break this study down, from the national results. We also have state results, and then afterwards we broke it down using county level information to build up metropolitan areas using combined statistical area designations. And here you see just a sampling of some of the largest benefits across the country in terms of where the benefits showed up the most. So everywhere from Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, Chicago, and on. Everyone on this list roughly had $1 billion or more in public health benefits on an annual basis, some with far more. And I think when you look at Los Angeles, for example, major metropolitan area, major pollution burdens to start with, and also heavy refining, heavy port traffic, heavy freeway traffic, all in a very designated area. So The report has a lot of additional information on the state-level benefits, and including state-by-state breakouts of the health effects that we talked about just a moment ago. The report also covers some of the policy recommendations of the American Lung Association, and this is just a very snippets of each one, but we looked at federal, state, local, and individual actions that can support the transition to zero-emission vehicles to really take these potential benefits into the real world. And a lot of what I've shared here is really focused on infrastructure and wanting to make sure that at all levels we're doing everything possible from public agencies to really invest and accelerate the deployment of infrastructure so that we're tackling that at the same time we're pushing for stronger zero emission vehicle standards and the technologies. The costs are coming down, making sure that the infrastructure is there to support drivers and fleets and businesses in making this transition. We also have a significant number of resources on our webpage that I'll put up here, state by state or region by region fact sheets that kind of lay out the health benefits in each region of the country, as well as state by state annual benefits in terms of the monetized public health values. We have the full report that the American Lung Association released that has a lot of the information that I put out at the beginning here about the State of the Air report from last year, as well as some of the research on transportation pollution, health effects, that kind of thing. We also have the technical documentation that Seth and his team put together that you can certainly poke through and take a look at. That's all on our webpage, which is lung.org/EV. And then the last slide that I wanted to kind of highlight was there was a significant amount of interest in this report when it came out last year, and we're still seeing a lot of interest in it today. We see these findings about public health benefits of zero-emission transportation showing up not just at the release of the report, but in testimony and ongoing media coverage, where people are using the report to kind of highlight the public health and air quality benefits of this transition and why it's so important that we're pushing all in the same direction to get to zero emission technologies as quickly as possible. So with that, I think we'll end our portion of the presentation. And Dylan, I don't remember if you wanted to take questions now or later, but thank you all for your attention and happy to continue the conversation.
Great. Thank you, Will and Seth. Yeah, we can pause for a question or two if anybody has any. Again, you can put them in the chat or press *6 to unmute your line and ask the question directly. But we can also hold questions till the end since I know we have another presentation. So why don't we dive into that and we can go into questions at the end. Next, I want to introduce Paul Allen, who's the Senior Vice President of MJ Bradley. And he recently led a study on a similar topic, but whereas the last study was pretty kind of top-down and a modeling approach, this was more community-focused, really honing in on the Newark area. So I want to invite Paul to start, and I will start sharing your presentation on my screen right now.
Okay, thanks very much, Dylan, and that's great. You can just go on to the next slide, please. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to be at a NASEO meeting again. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction of the Newark Community Impacts of Mobile Source Emissions report, which was published back in November. We'll share project goals, our analytical approach, the key findings, and then perhaps we can, at the end, have time for a general conversation about thoughts on environmental justice, community-based participatory research projects. You can go to the next slide, please, still. So this is indeed the outcome of a community-based participatory research project, which was completed in partnership with the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance and NRDC. The study evaluates the transportation-related pollution burden that EJ communities experience in the port-adjacent parts of Newark, New Jersey. And I'll show you some maps in a minute. It highlights which transportation sources are the largest contributors to pollution exposure across the region generally, but most importantly in hyper-local specific hotspot areas by census tract blocks. It then analyzes potential pathways specifically focused on electrification to reduce transportation-related emissions. So very much in keeping with what you just heard from our friends at ALA. If we can go to the next slide, please. The study was conducted in full collaboration with the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, which is a statewide alliance of organizations and individuals focused on a wide range of environmental justice issues. I want to emphasize that NJEJA led and we followed. So this is indeed a community-based participatory research model. It's built on the strengths and resources within the community itself to integrate and achieve a balance of between the research and with a bias toward action for the mutual benefit of all of the partners. As the lead partner in the project, NJEJA provided guidance and input based on their experience of their neighborhoods and helping to ensure that the study proved useful to them. And I'll say more about that toward the end of this discussion. So it began with them essentially establishing the geographic scope, determining what sources needed to be included, identifying local hotspots. So here you can think of idling locations of medium and heavy duty trucks and buses, possible sensitive areas, schools, healthcare facilities, and the like, helping to prioritize the pollutants and the mobile sources of most interest, and then facilitating feedback from local residents through the Coalition for Healthy Ports, which is a collection of many organizations that have been working, I guess you could say, have been working on the Port of New York and New Jersey for many years. And then finally shaping scenarios and highlighting local priorities for electrification analysis. Please, the next slide. So what were our goals? Well, to explore the impact of transportation emissions across the Newark study area with a high degree of spatial resolution. That was really important. Identify ways in which electrification could provide emissions reduction benefits to the Newark study area community. Create a series of cases that have useful data points and findings for the community, for officials in the community, and for advocates to use, and then to engage with community partners to get feedback, design scenarios that best fit local conditions, and ensure that the results are used and useful. Next slide, please. Very small type, but it's important that I tell you some of what's here. The study area for this project is essentially the eastern wards of Newark, New Jersey. That's the part of Newark that is hard up against the Port of New York and New Jersey and the Port of Elizabeth. And it sort of ends at the main thoroughfare that runs through downtown, runs north-south through downtown Newark. So it does not include the residential parts of Newark that are west of downtown. So within that study area, there are an annual VMT of more than 3 billion miles. Around 20% of that traffic is medium and heavy duty trucks or buses, and that traffic is heavily concentrated along certain roadways. If you're familiar with Newark, you know that this is the This is the New Jersey Turnpike and the corridors leading into New York City. In addition, port and rail yard activity contribute very much to local transportation emissions. Further context, transportation is the highest source of NOx emissions in New Jersey, and it's also a primary precursor of ozone pollution and a large portion of PM and black carbon emissions. And of course, as our friends at ALA just said, these emissions are known to cause serious health problems. Electrification is an opportunity here. Electric vehicles have no tailpipe emissions. We just heard that there are. That does not mean they have zero emissions. There are brake and tire emissions. Reducing local emissions of NOx and particulate matter, however, is a strong benefit of EVs. Electrification can also help to reduce greenhouse gas impacts on the health and welfare of the public and the effects of climate change. Next slide, please. So a little bit about our modeling approach. So we did a very deep inventory of VMT and the types of vehicles traveling inside this study area. So we used National Highway Performance Monitoring System traffic data. We obtained all of the New Jersey Transit bus routes and bus counts. The Port of New York and New Jersey has a multi-facility emissions inventory, which is quite detailed and very helpful. So this emissions inventory includes port emissions from ocean-going vessels at dock, not in transit in the harbor, at dock. It includes ground support equipment at the seaport as well as at the airport, and it includes idling assumptions. It does not include aircraft, I should be quick to say, but it does include ground support equipment at Newark International Airport. Then we used the EPA models moves to get emissions rates and the AirScreen model for dispersion curves. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a sec. And then we also obtained historic wind direction data from at the airport and applied that across the study area. And then we purchased IHS Polk registrations for vehicles in residence in the study area and their emissions rates. And one of the things that we not surprisingly discovered in looking at that data is that the vintage of vehicles registered inside the study area skews old. So these are older cars and trucks by and large. We then used a GIS spatial model that we have used extensively, working with initiative state departments of transportation to assess optimal locations for charging infrastructure for EVs. We used that model to look very carefully within the study area at where relative emissions would be. So that helped us to create an assessment of emissions exposure across the whole region. And I should say that we included a 1 mile buffer in all directions around the immediate study area to account for the inflow of air emissions from other sources outside of the immediate area. But the whole purpose was to identify relative contributions of various different mobile sources across the region. So quick to say, for those of you who know Newark, there's a tremendous amount of stationary source pollution in Newark, New Jersey, and we did not include those sources, except insofar as we looked at the potential of increase in emissions from the electric generating units that are located inside the study area on the hypothetical that all of the charging for vehicles would come from those generating units. That's probably not the way it would actually happen, but that was a hypothetical that we used to just test whether you're just moving emissions from mobile sources to stationary sources. And then the outputs are used to assess potential emissions reductions from various different levels of vehicle electrification. And then the data displays are in heat maps and in charts that show relative contributions at key locations. And if we go to the next page, we can show you some of that.
Sure thing, Paul. And just want to give you a 5-minute warning because I want to save some time for Q&A.
Okay, I think I can get it in about 5 minutes, maybe. Go to the next slide, please. So basically we're looking at NOx, PM, 2.5 black carbon, light duty vehicles, buses, medium and heavy duty trucks, and as I said earlier, the heavier engines at ports, rail yards, and the airport. You can go to the next slide. Very importantly, the New Jersey EJ Alliance gave us a list of several receptor sites, including the Hawkins Street Elementary School, the Newark Preschool Council. Those are both in the same census tract block. And then not very far away, the Kidney Dialysis Center at Fresenius and a preschool close by. So these are two separate census tract blocks. What these bar charts show you is that we looked at sources of emissions from inside the census tract, and then we looked at how much the dispersion model would show would come in from outside of the census tract. And in both cases, what you can see is that most of the emissions inside these two, close to these two sites, come from residential traffic. But the actual emissions exposure, the burden, depends on proximity to larger sources of emissions, such as in the case of the Kidney Dialysis Center, being about a third of a mile away from the Oak Island Rail Yard. Most of the NOx and PM and black carbon exposure actually comes from the rail yard, whereas at the Hawkins Street Elementary School, it's mostly from medium and heavy duty trucks. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the key findings, not surprisingly, I suppose, the highest transportation burden can be found in locations close to high density truck and bus routes. However, we also show that total emissions exposure and relative contribution varies very significantly across the study area, even though the entirety of the study area is only about 10 miles running north to south. Emissions of PM 2.5, black carbon, and NOx, particularly from locomotives and port operations, have the highest overall air quality impact, followed by medium and heavy duty vehicles. An important thing to note here is that in the years immediately in front of us, the next 5 to 10 years, we have the opportunity to electrify medium and heavy duty trucks. And that opportunity is growing monthly. It is not to say that we couldn't electrify port operations. Shore power is an expensive thing, but it's totally doable from a technical standpoint. And we could clean up rail yards, but the near-term opportunity is medium and heavy-duty trucks. And then finally, population centers and residential areas in close proximity to these roadways would benefit enormously from emissions reductions, particularly emissions reductions of particulates and NOx. And so, what we came to at the end was a set of general recommendations for policies such as the California Advanced Clean Truck Rule, the California Heavy Duty Low NOx Omnibus Rule, and a whole suite of California port electrification goals. And I guess we hope tentatively, at least good news is that the state of New Jersey is looking very seriously at those policies. This report has been used in discussions with New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, with EPA Region 2, definitely with the Port of New York and New Jersey. And we have participated in presentations of the findings of the study, its methodology, and a tool that we have developed to drill down on specific census tracts to do comparative analyses. And that has been used in discussions with the city of Newark around zoning and changes to the zoning for some of the avenues that feed into the Port of New Jersey, where there are proposals to site new warehouses and TDLs for increased logistics and freight movement. And all of that would, of course, bring even more trucks into the vicinity that we're talking about here. So I'll stop there. I hope that we have at least a few minutes for discussion. I guess I would want to add that one of the things that we felt quite good about was the nature of the collaboration here, and the extent to which technical analyses seem to be valuable to community organizers and community advocates who have felt that they've not been sufficiently able to describe the circumstances that they actually encounter in their daily lives. So that's where I'll stop.
Great, thank you so much, Paul. So I just want to encourage anybody that has questions, please type it into the chat, or you can unmute by pressing *6. We got one question. This was directed at Will and Seth, but Paul, feel free to hop in as well. Ben from South Carolina was just wondering if the study identified a particular vehicle class or action that a state agency could take that would have the biggest benefit on emissions reductions and health.
Thank you very much for the question. And while our report didn't break down the health benefits based on which of the 10 vehicle classes, and I think as Paul kind of just noted, we know that heavy-duty engines, medium and heavy-duty trucks especially, are typically some of the largest contributors to NOx emissions, for example. And so NOx emissions that impact ozone and particle levels, but also diesel particulate matter, toxic air contaminant. So we know that there's a significant need for the cleanup of the heavy-duty fleet. Paul mentioned some of the California standards that were passed last year, both on cleaning up the combustion fleet and cleaning and spurring the transition to zero-emission medium and heavy-duty trucks. So I think that's one thing that I would kind of note in response is just the burden of air pollution in many places is driven by heavy-duty trucking, and then within the passenger vehicle segment, we tend to see a larger contribution to greenhouse gases. So again, there's a significant need there for zero-emission vehicles, but the passenger vehicle fleet also contributes a great deal to our air pollution burden. So the cleanup is important on both fronts. There's different kind of breakdowns I just wanted to flag.
Yeah, thanks, Will. I think that's perfect. I would just say that we did look at the emissions for each of the categories, but we didn't. All of the on-road emissions were rolled up together. Not exactly, but rolled it into the categories that COBRA considers by vehicle class for the outputs, and then it computes sort of the total benefits from all of its on-road vehicles. So we didn't isolate the passenger vehicles versus buses, for example, for the health benefits.
Great, thank you. And Paul, I know when we were talking about this, we're kind of talking about how the community organizations in Newark really kind of shaped the study and kind of the direction you went with it, and it kind of took a bigger emphasis on ports than you were expecting. I was just wondering if you could touch on kind of the community engagement process and how that impacted the final outcome.
Sure. It was completely fundamental and central to the entirety of the study. I should mention a couple of names just because they were so important here. So Melissa Miles, who's the executive director of the New Jersey Environmental Justice Alliance, along with Nikki Sheets, who's a professor at Edison University in New Jersey, and Anna Baptista, who's a professor at the New School in New York. They really led the overall shape of the study, and they questioned every data point. And they're very well trained environmental professionals. They know exactly what they're doing, and they wanted to be able to ensure that there was an accurate summation of the relative effects of all of these mobile sources, recognizing, as they did much better at the outset than we did, that emissions from the port and the airport, the mobile sources at those locations are and the rail yards are just tremendous. And so while it's very important that we focus on the vehicles that are purchased by fleets and purchased by families and individuals and businesses, there is this other whole category of heavy equipment, particularly in port adjacent communities, that people may not think about as much, but there it is, and it's adding tremendously to the overall burden. But having said that, it was also quite clear that there was a sense that the opportunity has emerged with the advent of much better electric vehicles and much better and cheaper electric drive chains and lower battery costs and all the things that we all understand, that the opportunity to do something about the truck and automobile traffic is right now, and we don't want to wait. I guess that was their point. And so one of the things that we don't include in this study is the community impacts of just tremendous volumes of traffic, the noise, the safety considerations, just the impact on the quality of life, and that's maybe I guess that might feel like a little bit of a stretch outside of NASEO's ambit, but it really matters. And I guess the last point that I would make is that in these discussions about climate policy and air quality, if environmental justice becomes a focus of the conversation, these days it has a tendency to really become the very high priority in the conversation. And if you're talking about some of these policies and environmental justice isn't part of the discussion, then it's not clear that the focus is entirely relevant. So I think we're at an interesting moment in the history of these conversations about air quality in America. I'd be curious to hear what our friends at ALA and ICF, who've been at this also for a very long time, if they're witnessing the same phenomenon.
Well, I'll just say that absolutely yes. We know that just how important the role of work like yours and the information we're trying to put out to highlight the impacts of air pollution in communities that have been most historically underserved and overburdened, and really making sure that the policy strategies and investments, for that matter, are being targeted into communities that need them the most in order to experience the public health benefits. So I appreciate you raising that, and certainly it's something we've tried to focus on, especially within our most recent State of the Air report, and highlighting the disparities and pollution exposures and health disparities. And obviously, we're also very concerned in the disparities that have been experienced due to COVID as well. So there's a lot of interaction between the exposures and air pollution burdens and the poor health outcomes and deaths due to COVID that interacted, in real terms just over the last year. So I appreciate that. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of our work and research, and would be happy to follow up with anyone by email. I do have another commitment I have to jump off for, so I'm going to drop my email in the chat. And thank you again, Dylan, for setting this up, and for everyone for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much to all of our presenters for joining on the call and sharing their work with us. And thanks for everybody for joining the Zoom call. We just hit the hour, so we'll end the session here, but I'll send out a recording, and everybody should have my email if you need any follow-up, and I'm happy to connect you with some of the speakers or provide any more information needed. So thanks everybody again for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.
Thank you.